You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain someone's watching you, but every time you look, there's nothing there? That tiny prickle at the back of your neck, that sense of wrongness that makes your skin crawl? Well, what if I told you that sometimes that feeling isn't paranoia at all? Sometimes there really is something watching, and sometimes what it wants is far worse than you could ever imagine. This is the story of what happened to Sarah Mitchell in the autumn of 2019. A story about the darkest kind of hunger, about traditions that should have died centuries ago, and about the terrible price some people are willing to pay for things they can never have. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't a story with a neat little moral at the end. This isn't about learning lessons or becoming a better person. This is simply about survival and the horrifying realization that sometimes the people who smile at you across the dinner table are the very ones sharpening the knife behind their backs. Sarah was 28 when it started. She'd been married to David for 3 years, and they'd just found out she was pregnant. Their first child. You can imagine the joy, can't you? The excitement, the planning, the dreams of tiny fingers and first words, and all those precious moments parents live for. They told David's family first, gathered everyone together for a Sunday dinner to share the news. Sarah still remembers the way David's aunt, Margaret, went completely still when they made the announcement. Everyone else was cheering, hugging, crying happy tears. But Margaret just sat there, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, staring at Sarah with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even sadness. It was something deeper, something that made Sarah's champagne suddenly taste like ashes in her mouth. But then Margaret blinked, and the moment passed, and she was smiling and congratulating them with everyone else, and Sarah told herself she'd imagined it. Margaret was David's father's younger sister. She'd never married, never had children of her own. There were whispers in the family, of course, there always are. Some said she'd been engaged once, decades ago, but her fiancé had died in a car accident. Others claimed she'd never wanted children, that she'd chosen her career over family. But Sarah had caught Margaret sometimes, watching mothers with their babies in restaurants or parks, and the look on her face was pure, undiluted longing, the kind of want that hollows you out from the inside. 2 weeks after they'd announced the pregnancy, Margaret showed up at their house unannounced. Sarah was alone. David had gone to Portland for a business conference, wouldn't be back for 5 days. Margaret stood on the doorstep with a large wrapped box and that same unsettling smile. She said she'd brought a gift, something special for the baby. Sarah invited her in, because what else could she do? You can't just leave family standing on your porch, can you? Margaret placed the box on their coffee table, her movements oddly ceremonial, almost reverent. Inside was an antique mirror, ornate and beautiful, the frame carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in Sarah's peripheral vision. Margaret explained it was a family heirloom passed down through generations. She said it was meant to protect pregnant women, to ward off evil spirits that might harm the unborn child. Sarah thought it was a bit odd, but she thanked Margaret politely. The mirror was beautiful, in an unsettling sort of way, and she found herself placing it on the dresser in their bedroom, angled so she could see it from the bed. That night was when things started to feel wrong. Sarah woke at 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels thinnest, most vulnerable. She woke because she'd heard something. A sound like fingernails scraping slowly down glass. She lay there in the darkness, her heart hammering, listening. There it was again. Scrape, 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 coming from somewhere in the room. She reached for the lamp, her hands shaking so badly she nearly knocked it over. The light flooded the room with harsh yellow brightness, and everything looked normal. Everything except the mirror. Sarah could have sworn, absolutely sworn, that for just a split second before the light came on, there had been something reflected in that mirror that shouldn't have been there. Not her bedroom, not her furniture. but another room entirely, one with walls that seemed to pulse like living flesh, and a figure standing in the shadows, watching her with eyes that gleamed like polished coins. But in the lamplight, the mirror showed only her room, normal and mundane. Sarah told herself it was pregnancy hormones, stress, and overactive imagination. She turned off the light and went back to sleep, or tried to, because every time she started to drift off, she'd feel it again. That sensation of being watched. That absolute certainty that something was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight for her body. The dreams started that same night. In them, Sarah would be in a room she didn't recognize, dim and cold and smelling of earth and old blood. She'd look down and see her belly swollen with pregnancy, but something would be wrong with it. The skin would be moving, bulging, as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. And there would be a voice, Margaret's voice, whispering in her ear, telling her not to worry, telling her everything was going to be fine, telling her that some women were meant to be mothers and some women were meant to give life in other ways. Sarah would wake from these dreams gasping, drenched in sweat, her hands clutching her stomach as if to protect the tiny life growing there. But here's the thing that really terrified her. Each time she woke from one of these nightmares, she'd catch a glimpse of that mirror, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, she'd see Margaret's reflection standing behind her, even though Margaret wasn't in the room at all. Just standing there, watching, with that same strange smile on her face. David called every night from Portland, asking how she was, if everything was okay. Sarah wanted to tell him, wanted to pour out all her fears and anxieties. But how do you explain something like this? How do you tell your husband that you think his aunt, his family, might be doing something to you, something dark and incomprehensible? So she said she was fine, just a little tired, and he said he'd be home soon, and she hung up feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. On the third night, Sarah woke to find she couldn't move. Sleep paralysis, the rational part of her brain whispered. It happens to lots of people. Nothing supernatural about it. But she could feel hands on her, cold hands pressing against her stomach, and she could hear breathing, ragged and hungry, right next to her ear. She tried to scream but her throat wouldn't work, tried to thrash but her limbs were locked in place. And in the mirror, she could see Margaret, clear as day, leaning over her motionless body, whispering words in a language Sarah had never heard before, words that seemed to make the air itself contract and shudder. When Sarah finally managed to break free from whatever held her, gasping and flailing, she was alone in the room. The clock read 3:14 in the morning. Her stomach hurt, a deep cramping pain that made her whimper. She stumbled to the bathroom, terrified she was miscarrying, but there was no blood, just pain, and a strange tingling sensation, as if something was being pulled out of her slowly, inexorably. She called Margaret the next morning. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. She asked Margaret about the mirror, about its history, about the symbols carved into the frame. Margaret's voice on the line was warm, friendly, concerned. She said she didn't know much about the symbols, just that it was old, very old, and had always been in the family. She asked if something was wrong, if Sarah was feeling all right. Sarah wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but instead she heard herself saying everything was fine. She was just curious. Thank you for the lovely gift. After she hung up, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, really looking at it for the first time. Those symbols weren't decorative. They were purposeful, deliberate, carved with the kind of precision that spoke of ritual and intent. She pulled out her phone and started photographing them one by one, planning to search for their meaning online. But every photo she took came out blurred, distorted, as if something was interfering with the camera's ability to capture the symbols clearly. That afternoon, Sarah started feeling sick. Not morning sickness. This was different. A bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel like wading through concrete. She lay down for a nap and fell immediately into another nightmare. This time, she was in what looked like a basement, stone walls slick with moisture, candles burning with flames that gave off no warmth. Margaret was there, along with 2 other women Sarah didn't recognize, all of them standing in a circle, chanting. And in the center of that circle was Sarah herself, or her body at least, lying on a table, unconscious, her pregnant belly exposed. As Sarah watched from outside herself, Margaret approached her body with something in her hands. A knife, ancient and ceremonial, its blade inscribed with more of those writhing symbols. Margaret raised the knife, still chanting, and Sarah understood with perfect, terrible clarity what was about to happen. This wasn't about harming her, not really. It was about taking the life growing inside her. Taking the one thing Margaret had always wanted but could never have. Sarah woke screaming. Her phone said she'd been asleep for 45 minutes. She called David immediately, begging him to come home, telling him something was wrong. She needed him there. He said he'd leave right away, catch the first flight he could, be home by morning. Sarah hung up and looked at the mirror. Really looked at it. And for the first time since Margaret had brought it, she saw her own reflection clearly. She looked terrible, pale, gaunt, as if something was feeding on her, draining her slowly. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. And behind her reflection, barely visible in the dim afternoon light filtering through the curtains, she saw them. The 3 women from her dream, standing in her bedroom, watching her. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, they were gone. But she knew with a kind of bone-deep certainty that bypasses logic entirely, that they had been there. That they were always there, just on the other side of something, waiting, watching, preparing. She tried to take the mirror down, grabbed it with both hands, intending to throw it out, smash it to pieces if she had to. But the moment her skin touched the frame, pain exploded through her body, a white-hot agony that felt like every nerve ending was being set on fire simultaneously. She jerked her hands away, gasping, and saw angry red welts rising on her palms, marks in the exact shape of those symbols carved into the frame. Sarah ran from the room, slamming the door behind her. She spent the rest of the afternoon and evening huddled on the couch downstairs, every light in the house blazing, afraid to go back into her bedroom, afraid to be in the dark, afraid of what she might see if she let herself look too closely at any reflective surface. She called her doctor, but what could she say? That her husband's aunt had given her a haunted mirror that was somehow stealing her pregnancy. They'd think she was having a breakdown, send her for psychiatric evaluation, maybe even try to section her for the safety of the baby. Night fell. David still wasn't home. His flight had been delayed by weather. He texted. He was so sorry. He'd be there as soon as he could. Sarah turned on the television for company, for noise, for anything to drown out the terrible silence of the house. She must have dozed off on the couch, because the next thing she knew, she was jolting awake to the sound of her own name being called. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. The voice was coming from upstairs, from her bedroom. It sounded like Margaret, but wrong somehow. Too smooth, too liquid, as if it was just imitating human speech without quite understanding how it worked. Sarah grabbed her phone, her keys, ready to run out of the house entirely. But then she heard it again. Sarah, don't you want to see your baby? She should have run. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. But something made her climb those stairs, step by terrified step, drawn by a compulsion she didn't understand and couldn't fight. The bedroom door was open. The room beyond was dark except for a strange pulsing light coming from the mirror. Sarah stepped inside. The mirror no longer showed her room. Instead, it showed that same stone chamber from her dreams, the one with the walls that seemed alive. And there, in the center, was Margaret, holding something in her arms. A baby. Sarah's baby. She knew it somehow, knew it with the same certainty that it was still inside her, still growing, still safe. but it was also there, in that other place, in Margaret's arms, and Margaret was whispering to it, singing to it, loving it in a way that was all the more horrible for being genuine. Sarah stumbled backward and the image shifted. Now the mirror showed her own reflection again, but she wasn't alone. Margaret was behind her, so close Sarah could feel cold breath on her neck, but when Sarah whirled around, no one was there. This was the moment Sarah understood. The mirror wasn't just showing her another place. It was a doorway, and Margaret was using it to reach through, to touch her, to claim what she wanted. Sarah grabbed her phone and did the only thing she could think of. She called Margaret. The phone rang twice before Margaret picked up, her voice bright and friendly. Sarah asked where she was. Margaret said she was at home, reading. Why? Sarah asked if Margaret had been to the house. Margaret laughed and said no, of course not. Was everything all right? Sarah could hear it in her voice though. The satisfaction, the hunger, the absolute conviction that what she was doing was justified, even righteous. Sarah said she wanted to return the mirror, that it didn't fit with their decor after all. Margaret went quiet for a long moment. Then she said that would be a shame. She said the mirror had been in the family for so long, had witnessed so many births, so many beginnings. She said it would break her heart to take it back now, especially when it was clearly doing its job so well. And then she hung up. Sarah looked at the mirror, really looked at it. The symbols carved into the frame were glowing now, pulsing with that same unnatural light. And in the reflection, she saw herself, 8 months pregnant, then 9, then giving birth. But something was wrong with the birth, something was reaching in and pulling, and the baby that emerged wasn't being delivered to Sarah at all, but to the shadowy figures standing in that stone chamber. She understood then. Margaret wasn't going to harm the baby. She was going to take it. Somehow, through whatever dark ritual she'd enacted, whatever pact she'd made, Margaret was going to steal Sarah's child, draw it through some impossible pathway from one womb to another, leaving Sarah with nothing but emptiness and grief. And the truly terrifying part was that no one would believe it. Sarah would simply miscarry, a terrible tragedy, but it happens, and somewhere else, Margaret would be caring for a baby everyone believed she'd adopted, a baby that was somehow, impossibly, Sarah's biological child. Sarah needed help, but who could she turn to? Who would believe her? She thought of David's grandmother, Elena, David's father's mother, Margaret's own mother, still alive at 92 and sharp as a razor. If anyone knew about Margaret's true nature, it would be Elena. Sarah called her, tried to explain what was happening, but it was hard to put into words that didn't sound like raving madness. Elena listened in silence. When Sarah finished, Elena sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. Elena said she'd hoped it was over. She said Margaret had tried this before, decades ago, with a cousin Sarah had never met. The cousin had lost her baby, a late-term stillbirth, and Margaret had vanished for 6 months, returning with an infant she claimed to have adopted privately. Elena said she'd never had proof, just suspicions, just that same sinking certainty Sarah was feeling now. But by the time Elena had gathered evidence, had tried to do something about it, it was too late. The cousin had fallen into a depression so deep she'd never recovered, and Margaret had a daughter who was now grown and living overseas, never knowing the truth of where she'd really come from. Sarah asked why Elena hadn't warned them, hadn't said something when she announced her pregnancy. Elena's voice cracked when she said she'd prayed Margaret had outgrown it, that she'd found peace, that she wouldn't let her desperation poison another generation. She said she was sorry, so terribly sorry. She asked where David was. Sarah said he was coming home, would be there by morning. Elena said that wasn't soon enough. She said she was coming over, right now, and Sarah needed to stay away from that mirror until she got there. Sarah waited downstairs, every nerve on edge, watching the clock crawl toward midnight. She felt the baby move inside her, a reassuring flutter that made her want to weep with relief. Still there, still hers. But for how long? The cramping pain from before had returned, worse now, coming in waves that left her gasping. She timed them without meaning to, realized with horror that they were regular, getting closer together. But she was only 4 months along. This couldn't be labor. It was too early. Far too early. Elena arrived at 12:30, moving with surprising speed for a woman her age. She took one look at Sarah and her face went grey. She asked to see the mirror. Sarah led her upstairs, hanging back in the doorway while Elena approached it. The old woman stared at the mirror for a long moment, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. Then she touched it, and Sarah watched in shock as Elena's hand passed right through the surface as if it were water, disappearing up to the wrist into that other place. Elena jerked her hand back with a cry, and Sarah saw the same burns on her skin that Sarah herself had received. Elena said it was worse than she'd thought. She said Margaret had been planning this for a long time, had invested too much power into the ritual to back out now. She asked Sarah how bad the pain was. Sarah said it was getting worse, coming faster. Elena closed her eyes and said they needed to break the connection, sever the pathway between Sarah and the mirror, but it would have to be done carefully or it might harm the baby. Elena began moving around the room, pulling items from her purse. Candles, white and pure. Salt in a small cloth bag. A cross that looked ancient, the metal tarnished and worn. She told Sarah to lie on the bed and stay calm no matter what happened. Sarah obeyed, fear making her pliant. Elena began to chant words in Latin or maybe older, and Sarah felt the temperature in the room plummet. Her breath began to fog in the suddenly arctic air. The mirror's surface rippled and Margaret stepped through. Not a reflection, not an image. Actually stepped through, emerging from that stone chamber into Sarah's bedroom as if walking through a door. She looked furious and desperate and utterly convinced of the righteousness of her cause. She said Elena was interfering in something she didn't understand. She said Sarah didn't deserve this child, didn't appreciate what a gift it was. She said she'd been waiting for so long, suffering for so long, and this was her chance, her only chance. Elena told Margaret to go back, to end this madness before it consumed her entirely. Margaret ignored her, moving towards Sarah with outstretched hands, still whispering in that unknown language. Sarah felt something inside her respond to those words, felt her baby moving, stirring, being drawn toward Margaret as if toward a magnet. She screamed, clutching her stomach, and Elena moved between them, holding up that ancient cross. What happened next is hard to describe. The air itself seemed to tear, reality splitting like fabric. For a moment, Sarah could see both rooms superimposed, her bedroom and that stone chamber, existing in the same space. And in the chamber, she saw them. Not 3 women, hundreds, maybe thousands. Stretching back through time, all of them participating in this same ritual, all of them stealing life from women who had what they could never have. And she understood. This wasn't Margaret's invention. It was old, ancient, a tradition passed down through generations of desperate women who'd learned to take what they wanted, consequences be damned. Elena began speaking louder, more forcefully, and the cross in her hand began to glow. Margaret screamed, a sound of pure anguish, and Sarah realized Margaret wasn't evil. Not really. She was broken, hollowed out by longing and desperation and the kind of grief that comes from knowing you'll never have the one thing your body, your soul, was built to want. It didn't excuse what she was doing, but it explained it. And somehow, that made it worse. The mirror cracked. A single fracture running from top to bottom, and through it poured a cold wind that smelled of earth and decay and old sorrow. Margaret was being pulled back, drawn toward that crack, and she was fighting it, reaching for Sarah with clawed hands, screaming that it wasn't fair, that she deserved this, that she'd done everything right. Elena kept chanting, and the crack widened, and then Margaret was gone, pulled back through to that stone chamber, and the crack sealed itself with a sound like bones breaking. Sarah lay on the bed, sobbing with relief and pain and exhaustion. Elena slumped against the wall, looking every one of her 92 years. The old woman said it was done, the connection was broken, Sarah and her baby were safe. But when Sarah looked at the mirror, now marred by that single crack running through its center, she saw Margaret on the other side. Still there, still watching, still waiting. Because women like Margaret, women consumed by that particular kind of want, they never really gave up. They just waited for another opportunity, another chance, another desperate moment when their hunger might finally be satisfied. David came home 4 hours later, finding Sarah and Elena sitting in the kitchen, the mirror smashed to pieces in the garbage bin outside. Sarah told him everything, expecting him not to believe her, but Elena backed up her story, and David's face went pale. He said he'd noticed things about Margaret over the years, strange things, but had always dismissed them. He said his father had once warned him that Margaret had a darkness in her, but David had thought it was just family drama, old resentments. They buried the pieces of the mirror in the backyard, deep, and Elena performed another ritual over the spot, sealing it. She told Sarah that Margaret would try again, maybe not now, maybe not for years, but eventually. Because that was her nature. She was one of those people who traded their humanity for the chance at having what they wanted, and once you made that trade, there was no going back. Sarah gave birth 5 months later to a healthy baby girl. They named her Emma, and she was perfect. But sometimes, late at night, when Sarah was nursing her daughter, she'd catch a glimpse of movement in reflective surfaces. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A figure watching from somewhere just out of sight. And she'd wonder how many other women Margaret had approached over the years, how many had fallen prey to her desperation. She'd wonder if there were others like Margaret out there, trapped in their own hunger, ready to do anything, sacrifice anything, take anything to fill the emptiness inside them. David's family stopped inviting Margaret to gatherings. She'd shown her true nature, and even those who didn't fully believe Sarah's story had seen enough to be wary. But Sarah knew Margaret was still out there, still watching, still waiting, because that kind of want doesn't just disappear. It festers and grows and waits for another opportunity. And there are so many pregnant women in the world, so many chances. So much life just waiting to be taken by those desperate enough to reach for it. Sarah keeps every mirror in her house covered now. She's careful about gifts from relatives, about strangers who smile too warmly at her daughter. She's learned that the world is full of hidden hungers, of people who have found ways to take what they want through means most of us never imagine. And she's learned that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from monsters in the dark, but from the broken people we share our lives with, the ones who have learned to hide their desperation behind friendly smiles and generous gifts. So the next time someone gives you something, especially something old, something with history, something that feels just a little bit wrong, maybe think twice before you bring it into your home. Because some gifts come with prices you can't see until it's too late to refuse payment. And some people are so consumed by what they want that they'll do anything, reach across any boundary, violate any trust, to finally get what they believe they deserve. Sarah's daughter is 3 now, happy, healthy, loved. But Sarah still sees Margaret sometimes, in crowds, on street corners, always at a distance, always watching. A reminder that some hungers never die. They just hibernate, waiting for the next vulnerable moment, the next opportunity, the next woman foolish enough to accept a gift from someone whose smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. That's the real horror. Not that such people exist, but that they are so good at hiding, so practiced at pretending to be normal, that by the time you realize what they are, they're already inside your home, inside your life, reaching for the thing you treasure most. And if you're wondering whether Sarah ever felt sorry for Margaret, whether she ever thought about the pain and longing that drove her aunt-in-law to such darkness, the answer is yes. Sarah thinks about it all the time, because that's what makes it truly terrifying. Margaret isn't a monster. She's just human. Desperately, terribly human. And that means there are others like her out there, right now, living seemingly normal lives, waiting for their chance, their opportunity, their moment to reach across the boundaries of reality itself and take what they believe should be theirs. Their patients in hospitals, colleagues at work, neighbors next door, family members at holiday dinners. Normal people carrying enormous, impossible hungers that they've learned to feed in ways most of us never imagine. So keep your reflections close. Watch what you accept. And remember that sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like us, who want what we have with an intensity that would terrify us if we could truly see it. Because they are not trying to destroy us. They're just trying to take from us. And somehow, that's so much worse.